before we start, not to dwell on the current situation with COVID-19 going about. It just means that at the moment I'm kind of finding little time to do my kind of normal videos, etc. And one of the reasons that is because we do a lot for Cambridge Medical. It's it's going to be a little bit harder to do these videos over the next few months or however long, but just gonna basically do as much as we can and make it as normal as possible. And with that in mind, I'm going to do something on the Atari ST, the original Atari ST, or one of the early Atari STs, and make it a little bit more fun. Okay, so as you can see in the background, we have the Atari ST and the tour disc, which you got with this model. And this model is very different to the later edition STs, STEs, STFMs and so on. And it's very, very differently built. But this one is different again because it kind of didn't work when I first got it. And there's not many of these around, especially, in this kind of setup with the original disk drive, etc. So it was worth spending the time on repairing. And what I'm going to do is just quickly show you what was done to it to get it to this state, and not to go over how it was repaired, just a quick overview, and to let you know what one of these looks like inside. And then we're just going to do a review on it, and then also put it to work and see what it does, what it turns out like, what it can do, why is it different to the later models, and just have a little bit of fun with the early Atari ST. So let's have a look. Okay, because of work and having to do stuff for the medical board, which is great, but it's very time consuming, and this is my workshop floor at the moment. It's just got bits of projects everywhere. I really need to get on top of it, but as I say, people come first, and we need to help those with this virus or who are in trouble with this virus. Okay, so this is the main board, and as you can see, there's some quite hefty metalwork on top of a couple of the chips, including the processor. That's because this machine is faulty, or was faulty. It's a very different board to the regular Atari 520, and this one was not jumping to reset on the 68,000. I had to put a jumper on the underside, which would actually link to the reset switch, which would then reset this processor, and it would work fine. It's just because the processor is starting to fail. Now that will be replaced, but I will also replace these chunky bits of steelwork with aluminium heat sinks to keep the heat away from the processors, because that's what caused them to fail. And as you can see, it's running quite happily now. And that's job done. Okay, so this is your Atari 520 ST, one of the original 520 STs, which has a built-in modulator, so wasn't quite the first model, but it wasn't far away from it. And it uses an external floppy disk drive. It doesn't have an internal one. It's a lot smaller than the later model. It's a lot smaller than the later 520 STFM, 520 STE, and all the other models that kind of came after this one. It's identical in keyboard looks. It's got the same kind of very mushy Atari-esque keyboard, and it looks aesthetically very similar, but as you can tell, the back is much smaller because it doesn't have the built-in power supply. It doesn't have the built-in floppy disk. The floppy drive on it is single-sided, and it's basically that's why a lot of the software that you get for the later models are based on this drive, so they didn't alienate the early adopters of this machine, and also they didn't basically alienate or cut down on sales for people who also have the earlier machine, such as this one here. Now, I prefer this machine because it's nicer to look at. It's a lot more pleasing than the later model, because the later models did start getting quite large, in the same vein as the the Commodore Amiga A500. To my mind, if you take away the disk drive, it does actually look a little bit more modern. It looks kind of just like a standard keyboard you'd find on a PC clone. It's a nice looking machine. This one hasn't done too badly over the years. It's only slightly yellowed in places, and it is actually almost the correct colour as well, so this one could probably clean up a little bit more, and a little bit of UV light on it would probably bring it up to its as new condition. So it's not in bad condition whatsoever. Now, the worst thing about these is the cables. There's cables everywhere. There's cables for your floppy drive, there's cables for either your monitor or your RF. There's a big heavy duty power cable, and there's a massive power brick. I mean, the power brick is enormous on this thing. And also the floppy drive has its own separate power brick as well, so it might look smaller, but it takes up a lot more desk space and desk clutter. But overall it's quite a nice machine, to be honest. I mean, if you look at the Mega, the Atari Mega 1, you'll see the keyboard and the size of the case isn't that far away from the original 520 ST, but the keyboard is absolutely lovely on this machine. It's such a stunning keyboard. It's a very high quality unit, where the one on this machine is spongy, and it's the same keyboard as the next model up, which was the one most people know, the Atari 520 ST, ST-FM and so on. But underneath it all, this keyboard is very, very different. It uses a larger keyboard connector, so the keyboards are not interchangeable with the younger models. So the older models such as these, you cannot go out and buy a keyboard from another model, a younger model, and replace it if you have a keyboard problem with this. So that restricts you on parts a little bit, and parts availability, because these weren't produced for that long, and it is the only model with this case. They didn't go on and produce various other models such as they did with the later Atari ST range, but that's part of its charm. It's quite a nice looking machine. Okay, so on the back it's very different to the later models. You have a reset switch here, you have your power, and your power input, which is quite a large male DIN socket on this one. And then you have your MIDI ports, which are these two here, followed by your RF out. You also have your standard monitor port, followed by your printer and your modem on here. And then towards the end you've got your floppy drive port, and then as we pan around we also have a hard drive port here. So there's quite a number of ports on this machine. Now, one thing that a lot of Atari owners would have loved is the joystick ports, which are on the right hand side of the case and very easily accessible, unlike some models of the ST which were under the keyboard, and nobody really liked those. But they had to move it somewhere, because in the back of the later models you had your power supply all built into it, as well as here you would have had your floppy drive. Now that's what makes these a little messy, because you have cables for floppy drive, cables for power, cables for monitor or RF, and then you have the same thickness cable going into your floppy drive here, then another one for power, and it kind of gets a bit messy, and you can see why they made a slightly deeper case and put everything inside, because it was a lot more convenient. But in saying that, it doesn't detract from the way this machine looks. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a tour of the Atari ST. Not a lot of people have seen this program because it wasn't shipped with many STs, so it would be nice to have a quick look and a reminder of what it was all about when you first bought one of these 520 STs. So it's quite a nice introduction, quite a nice little graphic on there, and we're just going to get started. We're just going to take a brief desktop tour. And basically it's telling you about the various icons, such as the trash icon, the floppy drive, your files, how to change your view, and any applications that you might have on the desktop itself. And it also covers installing printers if you need to, but this is your desktop environment. Now the gem on this is 85, but apparently this demo is 86, so there's a bit of a mismatch, and it's going through showing you how you start a program from floppy disk. And this is everything that we take for granted now on modern machines, because we're used to Windows, we're used to using a pointer to tell the computer what you want to do with it, and it was kind of, remember, it was kind of new in those days, simply because you didn't have it. Most people knew DOS or CP/M or even the 8-bit machines such as BASIC, and this was a revelation in terms of how computers were used. So that's how they were asking you to use the desktop. So we'll go into accessories, and basically this is going to cover the accessories you could use with this computer. So you could accessorize it for colors, how to set your backgrounds for your desktop, how to alter the color that you would like to use on your desktop, and so on. And again, you must remember it was all pretty novel at the time, and it must have been really almost science fiction like if you'd come from an 8-bit micro, even the 8-bit Atari range. And it's a nice little introduction to what the computer can do. And also you can set your serial port for whatever you want to use it for. You remember at the time you could have used the serial port for just about anything. It was, you know, modems, printers, and various other accessories you wanted to run off of it. So anything that needed to use a serial port needed to be able to talk to it at a standard pace or a baud rate. And the same with the printers. Most of the printers were kind of dot matrix based or early adopters for laser printers. So it's now bringing you into what is called using Windows, which I'm sure Microsoft may or may not have had something to say about that, but basically it's an introduction to Windows. And how you can move them around the screen, open your windows up, and basically drag and drop them anywhere you liked, which is something we take for granted today. But on an 8-bit machine, it wasn't quite like that. And if you'd never been or had or owned or used an 8-bit machine, 8-bit machines and the use of BASIC and command line would have felt very alien after using an Atari ST, but it would also feel the same when you're coming from a machine that uses CP/M, DOS or BASIC to one of these. But generally though, if you have one of these, so pretty much any piece of software that was written for the later Atari ST, memory notwithstanding obviously, if you've only got a half meg machine against a meg, and software for the STE will also struggle to run on this unless it was written for both machines. Otherwise you won't be able to use it, because these don't have the second generation chipset in it. But most software will run because the ST didn't really have a huge library of games, because most people wanted to write software that would work on the range of Atari ST machines. And as you can hear, everything that this machine is also the later machines. They really didn't change it. They basically made it into a full-size case, moved around the circuitry on the board a little bit so you can have an internal power supply, internal floppy drive, and everything else stayed the same, such as the sound chip. The same sound chip was used, the same amount of onboard memory was the same, and the machines are broadly compatible. They're broadly the same machine. But it's just nice to have an original machine. Now, a lot of people ask, would I have a early version of Atari ST over the later versions? Only for its rarity value. That's probably the only reason why you would. One of the biggest issues is the cabling. There's lots of it. The other issue is the external drive. You know, the SF314 is very, very hard to find nowadays, and working ones of these are quite hard to find. And if something goes wrong with this machine, it's going to be a lot harder to find the parts. And I'm kind of guessing that from what I've seen by doing some research, and before I actually got hold of one of these, is the fact that parts are very, very difficult to find. You can find the individual chips for these. You can repair the boards if they're not too far gone, but what you can't do generally is find replacements for system boards, and power supplies as well. Power supplies are the biggie. If your power supply goes belly up, basically you'd have to make one out of a switching power supply. That would do the job. Or you probably would be thinking of maybe using it as a case for emulation, but then you've got another problem, because the keyboard is a different connector on it. It's a lot more pins, so unless you use an Arduino style board or Leonardo board or something similar and create your own interface, a lot of the interfaces that you see that you can get commercially to turn these into USB keyboards discount this model wholly. So the only other option you would have then is to get a keyboard from a later model and replace the entire keyboard, put your USB converter in the back of it, and then your Raspberry Pi or whichever machine you're using to emulate it, and it gets a lot more complicated. It also gets a lot more expensive. So if you've got one of these, I'd say kind of hang on to it and try and keep it as in good condition as possible. And if you saw the initial clip with the machine basically on the bench with the board out, you'll have seen some metal work basically on some of the key components, some of the key processors, including the 68000. And since that clip you saw, I've actually put nice aluminium heat sinks on there, because the 68000 in these machines does generate quite a lot of heat, and so do a lot of the associated chipsets in there as well, processors, etc. So the best thing you can do is heat sink them up and take off the RF shielding, because it's not really needed. You let some airflow through the case and literally heat sink up as much as you can find, because it will save these machines in the long run. They had problems with creep out of their square package chips that are used in these machines, and what happened is they eventually started creeping out of the board. And that's why, if you noticed, a lot of them are held in with big steel or brass retaining clips to stop them actually creeping out of their sockets. And there's a lot of problems with heat on these machines. So if you're going to keep one of these, then literally use as many heat sinks as you can find for the chips on these, and basically get the heat out of the system. The machine will last a lot longer. And the problem with this, as I mentioned at the beginning, was the processor, the CPU. It didn't reset properly when the machine was switched on. It wasn't jumping to its reset. Now that's easily solved by using the reset pin on the processor and then just taking it through to either to the reset switch at the back of the machine, and so it actually does a reset on startup. But that's another problem I've come across with the 68000 as it starts to fail. So they don't last forever, and they fail because they get hot, they start overheating internally, they start breaking down and so on. So it's not a processor you can't get hold of. It's one you can change quite readily, but you have to be careful not to lift the tracks, because these are old machines now, very old machines. So to prevent that, basically put heat sinks on as many of the chips as possible. The memory tends to run fairly cool in these, that's not a big issue, but processors, sound chips, when they're being used, they generate a lot of heat as well. So try and find some heat sinks that work and will take the heat out of the system. And as I said, the machine will last a lot longer, and you're taking care of something that's getting quite rare these days. Okay, this was a quick video on the one of the original style Atari 520 STs, and I quite like it. It's a nice looking machine. It was kind of one of the ones I was missing from my collection and hard to get hold of. This one wasn't working. It's had a repair. It's had a new 68000 processor, and but in the short term, when I was testing it, it had a quick fix to a reset on the CPU itself, so it was now jumping to a reset on command, which made it run, and it gave me the chance to find out what was wrong with it. And again, it's just a bit of patience, but overall it's a nice machine. But I can see why the later model was probably more popular. I'm guessing it was cheaper to build, because the external drive on this would have been an expensive add-on for the machine. The fact that the original was monitor only, which then probably made it a lot more expensive again, and when they started adding the RF modulator, that made it more accessible. But the sheer size of the power supplies for these, they are big hefty pieces of kit, and there's two of these, one for the disk drive as well, and that all adds up to quite a bulky and messy cabling solution. Whereas the later model, the ST, where you just basically plug in the power lead, something to your TV or your monitor, and you just had your mouse, and that was it. But in saying that, I'm glad I've got it. It's a nice looking machine, and I'm glad it's working, because there are so many out there that aren't working, have been left lying about, or left to kind of gather dust in cupboards and so on. So if you get a chance to get one, buy one. If you get a chance to get one that's not working, take a chance on it, see if you can fix it, see if you can find the fault, and then get another one in the world that does work and does do what it should do. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you will subscribe, and I hope that we'll see each other on this channel very shortly. And say it's getting a little bit more difficult time wise to make these, but that's down to the current situation, and with the fact that I'm doing a lot for, you know, the medical services as well, so that will change. It's not going to last forever, but in the meantime, stay safe and enjoy playing with your classic machines while you've got the chance. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye bye.